quiet villages and cozy parlors where teacups clink and roses bloom, Miss Marple watches and notices everything. Behind every smile, she sees the secrets, and where others see gossip, she finds the truth. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm your host, Hari. Isn't it lovely how these stories bring us together, no matter the distance? Tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? And have you ever guessed the culprit before Miss Marple? Let's begin. Chapter 1. A Jewel from the Past. It was a perfect summer day in St. Mary Mead, the kind that seemed to have been specially ordered for the annual village fete. The air was filled with the mingled scents of freshly cut grass, homemade cakes, and the sweet perfume of the roses that adorned many of the stalls. Miss Jane Marple, a slender, elderly lady with snow-white hair and the deceptively mild blue eyes of a Victorian gentlewoman, was presiding over the White Elephant stall with her old friend Mrs. Bantry. "My dear," said Mrs. Bantry, dabbing her forehead with a lace-edged handkerchief, "I do believe this is the most successful fete we've had in years. The weather has been most obliging." Miss Marple nodded in agreement, her nimble fingers sorting through the assortment of donated items that littered their table. There was the usual collection of unwanted bric-a-brac, slightly chipped china cups, outdated ornaments, and well-thumbed books with faded covers. The residents of St. Mary Mead were nothing if not generous with their discards. "Indeed, Dolly," she replied, "though I must say, some of these items are rather peculiar. I wonder who would have donated this." She held up what appeared to be a hand-carved wooden spoon with curiously elongated handle. "It looks positively pagan." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "That's from old Mrs. Pritchard, I believe. Her son brought it back from Africa. Now, what have we here?" Miss Marple had reached into a cardboard box that had just been delivered by one of the vicar's helpers. Her fingers closed around something cold and metallic. Drawing it out, she found herself holding an ornate Victorian brooch of exquisite craftsmanship. It was fashioned in the shape of a peacock, with golden feathers splayed in a proud fan. The tail was inlaid with small sapphires and emeralds, catching the sunlight and throwing back tiny rainbows. "Good heavens," breathed Mrs. Bantry, leaning forward to examine the piece. "That's rather special, isn't it? Not at all the sort of thing one expects to find at the White Elephant." Miss Marple turned the brooch over in her hands, her expression thoughtful. "It appears to be quite valuable. I wonder if it might have been donated by mistake." "Most certainly," agreed Mrs. Bantry with conviction. "No one would intentionally give away such a piece. It must be worth a considerable sum." At that moment, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, approached their stall, carrying a tray of teacups. She was a pleasant, practical woman in her 50s, with sensible shoes and a kindly face that bore the marks of perpetual concern for her parishioners. "Ah, I see you found a peacock," she remarked, setting down her tray. "Beautiful, isn't it? Most of today's donations came from Fairview House. Poor Mrs. Lacey passed away last month, you know, and her family has been clearing the place out." "Mrs. Lacey?" Miss Marple's interest was piqued. "I didn't know her well, but she always struck me as someone who valued her possessions. It seems odd that her family would donate something of this quality." "Perhaps they didn't realize its value," suggested Mrs. Clement. "Her granddaughter has been overseeing most of the clearing out. Such a quiet, reserved young woman." Miss Marple's gaze drifted across the bustling fairgrounds, coming to rest on a slender figure standing somewhat apart from the crowd. The young woman was dressed in a simple blue frock that accentuated her pale complexion. Dark hair was pulled back in a modest style, and she seemed to be watching the stall with particular intensity. When she realized that Miss Marple had noticed her, she quickly turned away and disappeared into the throng of villagers. "How curious," murmured Miss Marple to herself. The morning wore on pleasantly enough, with a steady stream of visitors to their stall. Shortly before noon, Dr. Haydock stopped by, his robust frame and hearty manner bringing a burst of energy to their corner of the fete. "Good day, ladies," he greeted them cheerfully. "Any treasures to be found among the cast-offs today?" Mrs. Bantry proudly displayed the peacock brooch. What do you make of this, Doctor? Dr. Haydock adjusted his spectacles and examined the piece with interest. Well, that's a remarkable coincidence. Do you know, this bears a striking resemblance to a brooch I once saw in a portrait at Gossington Hall. One of your ancestors, wasn't it, Mrs. Bantry? A family heirloom, as I recall. Mrs. Bantry frowned slightly. I don't remember any such piece in our family collections, but then again, Arthur would know better than I. He's always been more interested in the family history. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple found herself repeatedly drawn to the brooch. There was something about it that stirred her curiosity, a sense that it had a story to tell. She had learned over her many years that objects, like people, often carried secrets. The fete was beginning to wind down, the crowds thinning as villagers made their way home for tea, when a distinguished-looking gentleman approached their stall. He was tall and lean, with silver hair and the kind of aristocratic bearing that spoke of good breeding and comfortable means. His clothes were impeccable, if a little formal for a village gathering. I understand you have a brooch, he said, without preamble. A gold peacock with gemstones. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. Indeed we do, Mr. Harrington, he supplied. Edward Harrington. The brooch was donated in error, I'm afraid. It belongs to the Lacey estate, of which I am an executor. I would be happy to buy it back for a substantial sum, of course, for the church funds. There was something in his manner that struck Miss Marple as not quite right. His smile was pleasant enough, but it didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and watchful. That's very generous of you, Mr. Harrington, she said mildly. However, I think in cases like these, it's best to be absolutely certain of ownership. Perhaps the brooch should be held by the vicar until its rightful place can be established. A flicker of annoyance crossed Mr. Harrington's face, quickly smoothed away. As you wish, Miss Marple. Jane Marple. Miss Marple, I assure you there's no need for such formality, but if you insist, I shall speak with the vicar directly. After he had departed, Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple with raised eyebrows. Well, he seemed rather eager, didn't he? Perhaps too eager, Miss Marple replied quietly. And I noticed he didn't specify exactly how the brooch came to be donated in error. If he's truly an executor of Mrs. Lacey's estate, wouldn't he have overseen the disposal of her effects more carefully? The brooch was duly handed over to the Reverend Clement for safekeeping, despite Mr. Harrington's barely concealed impatience. As Miss Marple walked home that evening, she found herself pondering the day's events. The valuable brooch among the jumble sale items, the watching granddaughter, Dr. Haydock's chance remark about the Bantry family portrait, and the overly anxious Mr. Harrington. It all formed a curious pattern. Her reflections were interrupted the following morning by a telephone call from the vicarage. The Reverend Clement's voice was tense with concern as he informed her that there had been a break-in overnight. Nothing had been taken except one item, the peacock brooch. Miss Marple replaced the receiver thoughtfully. So the brooch was valuable enough to steal, but not valuable enough to simply purchase outright at a church fete. That suggested its worth went beyond mere monetary value. And if there was one thing Miss Marple understood well, it was that people would go to extraordinary lengths to protect their secrets. She picked up her knitting and began to work on the pink baby shawl she was making for her grandniece's expected child. Her fingers moved automatically as her mind sorted through the puzzle that had been laid before her. Like the intricate pattern of the shawl, she knew that all the loose threads would eventually come together, revealing the complete design. It was simply a matter of patience and careful observation. Chapter 2. The Suspicious Housekeeper. The morning after the break-in at the vicarage dawned with a persistent drizzle that seemed to match the mood of consternation that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, dressed in a sensible tweed suit and armed with an equally sensible umbrella, made her way carefully along the wet path to the vicarage. She had telephoned ahead to express her concern and to offer any assistance that might be helpful, though in truth, her primary motivation was curiosity. As she approached the vicarage, she observed with interest that Inspector Slack's police car was parked outside, The inspector was not one of Miss Marple's particular admirers. He considered her interest in criminal matters to be unnecessary meddling, while she found his methods somewhat lacking in psychological insight. Nevertheless, they had achieved a sort of grudging mutual respect over the years. Mrs. Clement greeted her at the door, looking harried and upset. "Oh, Miss Marple, how good of you to come. It's been such a dreadful business. Leonard is quite beside himself. He feels responsible, you see, for having agreed to keep the brooch here overnight." "Not at all his fault," Miss Marple assured her. "No one could have anticipated such a determined thief. I assume the police had been notified." "Yes, Inspector Slack is in the study now. He's been questioning everyone most vigorously." Miss Marple was shown into the sitting room, where she removed her wet things and accepted a cup of tea. Through the partly open door, she could hear the inspector's voice raised in irritation as he interrogated the vicar. "Most peculiar," the inspector was saying. "Nothing else taken, not even the silver candlesticks on the mantelpiece. Just this one brooch that nobody seems to know much about." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. It was indeed peculiar, but not perhaps surprising. She had sensed from the beginning that the peacock brooch was significant beyond its obvious value. When the vicar and the inspector finally emerged from the study, Reverend Clement looked pale and distressed, while Inspector Slack wore his usual expression of barely contained impatience. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, his tone suggesting that her presence was exactly what he had expected and dreaded. "I suppose you've come to tell us who took the brooch." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Not at all, Inspector. I merely came to offer my sympathies to the Clements. Such an unpleasant experience, having one's home violated in this way." The inspector grunted non-committally. "Well, if you'll excuse me, I need to examine the point of entry once more." As he strode out into the garden, Miss Marple rose to follow, murmuring something about wishing to leave the vicar and his wife to recover in peace. Outside, she observed Inspector Slack crouched beside a window at the rear of the vicarage. The ground was soft from the rain, and clearly visible in the mud were several footprints. "Small feet," remarked Miss Marple, coming to stand behind the inspector. "And quite narrow, too." Inspector Slack straightened up with a scowl. "Yes, well spotted, Miss Marple. Most likely a woman or a youth. The lock was forced with some kind of thin metal implement." "And nothing else was taken, you say?" "Not a thing. The vicar's study has several valuable first editions, and Mrs. Clement's silver was in the dining room. Whoever broke in knew exactly what they wanted." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "That would suggest someone who was aware of the brooch's presence here. Not many people would have known that, I imagine." "Just the people at the fete who saw it handed over, and whoever the vicar might have mentioned it to," agreed the inspector grudgingly. "We're making a list now." After taking her leave of the inspector, Miss Marple spent some time in seemingly aimless conversation with Mrs. Clement, during which she learned several interesting facts. The first was that Mrs. Lacey's former housekeeper, a Mrs. Simmons, had been behaving rather oddly since her employer's death. "Claiming items left and right," said Mrs. Clement with disapproval. "Things she insists Mrs. Lacey had promised her. The family has been most patient, but it's becoming quite awkward." "Did she mention a brooch specifically?" asked Miss Marple. "Not that I've heard, but she did speak of a promised inheritance that was being kept from her. Quite improper, in my opinion." The second interesting fact was that Mrs. Simmons had worked for Mrs. Lacey for over 30 years, coming to her shortly after Mrs. Lacey was widowed. "They were more like companions in a way," said Mrs. Clement. "Mrs. Lacey trusted her implicitly." The third and perhaps most intriguing piece of information was that Mrs. Simmons lived in a small cottage at the edge of the village, where she had relocated after Mrs. Lacey's death. This was evidently considered a step down from her former position, and Mrs. Clement expressed some surprise that she had not been provided for more generously in Mrs. Lacey's will. Miss Marple digested this information as she walked home through the now steadily falling rain. By the time she reached her cottage, she had formulated a plan. After changing into dry clothes and having a light luncheon, she placed a telephone call to Mrs. Simmons, introducing herself as a friend of Mrs. Bantry, who was in need of part-time domestic help. Would Mrs. Simmons be interested in discussing the possibility? The reply was cautious but affirmative, and an appointment was arranged for tea that afternoon. Miss Marple spent the intervening hours knitting and thinking, her needles clicking rhythmically as she considered what she knew and what she merely suspected. Mrs. Simmons arrived promptly at 4 o'clock. She was a neat, spare woman of about 60, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp, intelligent eyes that took in every detail of Miss Marple's sitting room. Her hands, Miss Marple noted, were small and narrow. "How do you do, Mrs. Simmons?" said Miss Marple pleasantly. "So kind of you to come in this dreadful weather. I do hope you didn't get too wet." "I'd manage well enough in the rain, Miss Marple," replied Mrs. Simmons, accepting a seat by the fire. Her voice was unexpectedly refined, suggesting an education somewhat above her station. "Now, I understand you're seeking household help." Miss Marple embarked on a detailed description of a fictitious friend's requirements, all the while observing her visitor carefully. Mrs. Simmons answered her questions politely, but with increasing impatience, and Miss Marple sensed that she was eager to leave. Eventually, she guided the conversation toward Mrs. Lacey. "I believe you were Mrs. Lacey's housekeeper for many years. Such a respected lady. It must have been a great loss to you." Mrs. Simmons's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Lacey was more than an employer to me. We had an understanding." "Indeed? How fortunate for you both. I understand her family is clearing out Fairview House now. So many lovely things were donated to our church fete. There was one piece in particular, a beautiful peacock brooch." The change in Mrs. Simmons was immediate and striking. Her back stiffened, and a flush of color spread across her cheeks. "The peacock. They gave away the peacock?" Her voice trembled slightly. "It was among the donated items, yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "Though I understand it's gone missing now." "Missing?" Mrs. Simmons's hands clenched in her lap. "They had no right at all. That brooch was promised to me. A keepsake," she said, "but they cleared the house before I could claim it." "How distressing for you," sympathized Miss Marple. Had Mrs. Lacey mentioned this bequest in her will? Mrs. Simmons' expression closed like a shutter. "There were arrangements. Private arrangements. It's not something I care to discuss with strangers." Miss Marple nodded understandingly. "Of course not. It's just that the brooch seems to have caused quite a stir, and Mr. Harrington was most anxious to retrieve it yesterday." Harrington, the name seemed to startle Mrs. Simmons. "Edward Harrington." "I believe that was the name, yes. Do you know him?" "By reputation only," said Mrs. Simmons quickly, but her eyes flickered to a silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece. Miss Marple followed her gaze. The photograph showed a much younger Mrs. Simmons standing beside a handsome military officer in uniform. There was something in the officer's features, the set of the jaw, perhaps, or the shape of the eyes, that bore a striking resemblance to the distinguished Mr. Harrington. "What a handsome young man," remarked Miss Marple innocently. "A relative of yours?" Mrs. Simmons stood abruptly, gathering her handbag. "I'm afraid I must be going, Miss Marple. I don't think I would be suitable for your friend's position after all. Good day to you." After she had departed, Miss Marple sat for a long time gazing at the fire. The afternoon had been most instructive, confirming several of her suspicions while raising new questions. The connection between Mrs. Simmons and Mr. Harrington was clearly more significant than a mere reputation, and both had strong emotional reactions to the peacock brooch. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to her friend, Miss Hartnell, a formidable lady who prided herself on knowing everything that happened in St. Mary Mead. Over coffee and seed cake, Miss Marple skillfully directed the conversation toward Mrs. Simmons. "Oh, yes," said Miss Hartnell with relish. "There's a story there, though it was all before your time in the village. Emily Simmons, she was Emily Parker then, was engaged to a very wealthy young man. The family put a stop to it, of course. They were old money, and she was just the daughter of the local schoolmaster." "How sad," murmured Miss Marple. And did she ever marry? Never did. Devoted herself to domestic service instead. Worked at Gossington Hall for a time before moving to Mrs. Lacey's household. There was some unpleasantness at Gossington, I believe. Something missing, though nothing was ever proven. This piece of information sent Miss Marple's thoughts racing in a new direction. Gossington Hall was the Bantry family home, and Dr. Haydock had mentioned seeing the peacock brooch in a portrait there. Could there be a connection? That evening, as Miss Marple was preparing for bed, she heard a soft thud at her front door. Opening it cautiously, she found no one there, but a folded note had been pushed through the letterbox. In a cramped, anonymous hand, it read simply, "Leave the past buried, or you may regret your curiosity." Miss Marple read the note twice, then carefully placed it in her knitting basket. Far from being intimidated, she felt a certain satisfaction. One didn't receive threatening notes unless one was getting close to the truth, and the truth, she suspected, was a tangled web indeed, with the peacock brooch at its center. She climbed into bed with a hot water bottle at her feet and her current detective novel on the bedside table, unread. Her mind was too full of the real mystery unfolding around her to spare attention for fictional crimes. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to Gossington Hall. It was time to learn more about the history of the peacock brooch and its connection to the Bantry family. As she drifted off to sleep, the image of the brooch floated before her mind's eye, its jewel tail feathers spreading like secrets waiting to be uncovered. In her experience, old secrets never remain buried forever. They had a way of rising to the surface, like bodies in the pond, revealing themselves to those patient enough to wait and observant enough to see. Chapter 3. Memories at Gossington Hall. The morning was bright and clear, as if the previous day's rain had washed the world clean. Miss Marple set out for Gossington Hall shortly after breakfast, dressed in her best grey silk and carrying a small basket of hothouse flowers from her garden. A social call required the proper observances, even when one's primary purpose was investigation. Gossington Hall stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead, a handsome Georgian building set amidst well-tended gardens. It had been the Bantry family home for generations, though in recent years Mrs. Bantry had been known to complain that it was rather too large for just the two of them. The Colonel, however, would not hear of moving. Miss Marple was shown into the morning room by the butler, where she found Mrs. Bantry surrounded by flower arrangements in various stages of completion. "Jane, how lovely to see you," exclaimed Mrs. Bantry. "You've caught me preparing for the charity luncheon tomorrow. The garden club is raising funds for the new children's ward at the hospital." "I've brought a few of my blue delphiniums," said Miss Marple, presenting her basket. "I remembered how fond you are of them. How thoughtful. They'll be perfect for the centerpiece." Mrs. Bantry gestured to a chair. "Do sit down. I'll ring for some coffee." Over coffee and delicate almond biscuits, they chatted amiably about village affairs. Miss Marple bided her time, waiting for the right moment to broach the subject of the peacock brooch. It came when Mrs. Bantry mentioned the break-in at the vicarage. "Such a shocking thing," she said, shaking her head. "And for just that one item, the brooch from our fete, though I must say it was rather an exceptional piece." "Indeed it was," agreed Miss Marple. Dr. Haydock mentioned that it resembled a brooch he'd once seen in a portrait here at Gossington. I was quite curious about that. Mrs. Bantry's expression brightened with interest. "Did he? How intriguing. I don't recall such a piece in our family collections, but then there are so many old portraits. Perhaps Arthur would know. He's in his study now, going through some family papers. Shall we ask him?" They found Colonel Bantry surrounded by leather-bound albums and faded documents, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He greeted Miss Marple warmly. "We've come to inquire about a peacock brooch," explained Mrs. Bantry. "Dr. Haydock seems to think it was in one of our family portraits." The Colonel's bushy eyebrows rose in surprise. "The Maharaja's gift? Well, well. It hasn't been seen in decades, but yes, it's in the portrait of your great-grandmother in the long gallery, Dolly." "May we see it?" asked Miss Marple. The long gallery was a feature of Gossington Hall that Mrs. Bantry rarely mentioned with pride. It was a grand space, somewhat faded in its glory, lined with portraits of Bantry ancestors looking variously stern, benevolent, or faintly surprised. Colonel Bantry led them to a portrait near the center of the gallery, illuminated by light from a high window. The painting showed a handsome woman in her 30s, with Mrs. Bantry's direct gaze and determined chin. She wore an elegant evening gown of deep blue, and pinned to her bodice was unmistakably the peacock brooch, its jeweled tail catching the artist's imagined light. "Lady Agatha Bantry," said the colonel proudly, "your great-grandmother Dolly. A remarkable woman by all accounts. She accompanied your great-grandfather on his diplomatic postings to India in the 1870s. "The brooch is exactly as I remember it from the fete," murmured Miss Marple. "The very same design." "Not merely similar," corrected the colonel. "It would be the very same brooch. It was unique, you see. A gift to Lady Agatha from the Maharaja of Rajputana in gratitude for her husband's diplomatic services during a period of unrest." "But how extraordinary that it should turn up at our church fete," said Mrs. Bantry. "If it's the same piece, that is." "I believe it is," said Miss Marple. "But how did it come to be in Mrs. Lacey's possession? Dr. Haydock implied it was a family heirloom." Colonel Bantry's face darkened slightly. "It should have been, but the brooch was stolen during a house party here in the 1920s. Never recovered. Caused quite a scandal at the time." As Miss Marple studied the portrait more closely, she noticed something she had initially overlooked. In the background of the painting, partially visible in the doorway, was the figure of a young maid. The artist had captured her with surprising attention to detail for such a peripheral element. There was something familiar about the maid's features. "The young woman in the background," she said carefully. "She looks rather like Mrs. Simmons in her youth." Mrs. Bantry peered at the portrait. "You know, I believe you're right, Jane. I hadn't noticed before, but there is a resemblance." Colonel Bantry adjusted his glasses and looked more closely. Emily Parker. Yes, she did work here as a young woman. Left under something of a cloud, as I recall." "Emily Parker?" Miss Marple's voice was deliberately casual. "Would that be the Mrs. Simmons who was Mrs. Lacey's housekeeper?" "One and the same," confirmed the colonel. "She was dismissed after the brooch disappeared, though nothing was ever proven against her. My father was reluctant to involve the police in what he considered a private matter." Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. The connection between Mrs. Simmons and the peacock brooch was growing clearer, but it still didn't explain Mr. Harrington's interest, nor the threatening no she had received. "Mr. Harrington," she said, as if the name had just occurred to her. "Do you know him?" An almost imperceptible tension entered the colonel's bearing. "Edward Harrington?" "Yes, he's been in touch recently. Claims to be writing a book on notable country house treasures. Been asking all sorts of questions about our family heirlooms." "How fascinating," said Miss Marple. "Was he particularly interested in the peacock brooch?" "As a matter of fact, he was," replied the colonel. "Seemed quite disappointed when I told him it had been stolen years ago." On their way back to the morning room, Miss Marple paused to admire a collection of miniatures in the hallway. "These are charming. Family members." "Various relatives and connections," said Mrs. Bantry. "That one there is Lady Agatha again, with her husband, and this one is, oh, I'm not entirely sure. Arthur, who is this?" The colonel examined the miniature with a slight frown. "That would be my uncle, Henry Bantry. Something of a black sheep, I'm afraid. There was a scandal involving a young woman. All hushed up, of course, but it caused quite a rift in the family." "Was the young woman by any chance Emily Parker?" asked Miss Marple. Her voice mild, but her eyes sharp. The colonel looked startled. "Good heavens, no. At least I don't believe so. It was all before my time. The young lady in question was someone with social connections. A house guest, I believe. The family paid her off, and she disappeared from society. Why do you ask?" "Mere curiosity," said Miss Marple. "One does wonder about these old family stories." Later, over more coffee in the morning room, Miss Marple asked to see the guest list from the house party when the brooch was stolen. Mrs. Bantry, now thoroughly intrigued by the mystery, was happy to oblige. It must be in the old engagement diaries, she said. Arthur keeps everything meticulously filed. The Colonel produced a leather-bound book from his study, its pages yellowed with age. Here we are, June 1925, the weekend of the summer solstice. We had quite a gathering. Miss Marple ran her finger down the list of names, most of them unfamiliar to her. Then she paused. Mrs. Lacey was a guest. Yes, she would have been quite young then, said Mrs. Bantry. Eleanor Vane, as she was before her marriage. Her family had connections to ours through the Northumberland branch. Miss Marple made a mental note of this connection. Eleanor Vane, later Mrs. Lacey, had been present when the peacock brooch disappeared, and now, decades later, the brooch had resurfaced among her possessions after her death. It was a connection that could hardly be coincidental. As they were saying their goodbyes in the entrance hall, a young woman entered from the garden. She was slender and dark-haired, dressed simply but with a certain elegance. Miss Marple recognized her immediately as the young woman she had observed watching the white elephant stall at the fete. "Ah, Miss Lacey," said Mrs. Bantry warmly. "How lovely to see you. Have you met Miss Marple? She's one of our village treasures." The young woman's composure faltered slightly at the introduction. "Miss Marple? Yes, I believe we've seen each other at the fete." "Indeed we did," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Though we weren't properly introduced then. You're Mrs. Lacey's granddaughter, I understand." "Yes, I'm Catherine Lacey." Her voice was cultured but held a slight tremor. "I've been staying in the village since grandmother's death, overseeing the clearing of Fairview House." "A sad duty," sympathized Miss Marple. "Your grandmother was highly regarded in St. Mary Mead." Miss Lacey's eyes darted nervously between Miss Marple and the Bantrys. "Yes, she was. Mrs. Bantry, I've come about the arrangements for tomorrow's luncheon. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, my dear," assured Mrs. Bantry. "Jane was just leaving. I'll see you out, Jane, and then Miss Lacey and I can discuss the luncheon details." As Miss Marple gathered her things, she noticed Miss Lacey watching her with an intensity that suggested she wanted to speak but was hesitant to do so. On an impulse, Miss Marple addressed her directly. "Perhaps we might walk together part of the way, Miss Lacey. I'm heading back to the village, and it's such a pleasant day for a stroll." Miss Lacey seemed torn between reluctance and relief. "Actually, Miss Marple, I've been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you, in private, if you wouldn't mind." Mrs. Bantry, always sensitive to social undercurrents, made a tactful withdrawal. "I'll just go and check on those flower arrangements. Take your time, Miss Lacey." When they were alone, Miss Lacey twisted her hands nervously. "Miss Marple, I understand you. That is, people say you have a certain insight into difficult matters." "I have some small experience in unraveling complications," admitted Miss Marple modestly. "Is there something troubling you, my dear?" Miss Lacey glanced around, as if to ensure they were truly alone. "It's about a family matter, a rather delicate one. I prefer not to discuss it here. Could we perhaps meet somewhere more private?" "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Would you care to join me for tea at my cottage tomorrow? Around 4 o'clock?" Relief flooded the young woman's face. "Thank you. I would appreciate that very much. It's about the peacock brooch, you see. I believe it holds the key to a secret my grandmother took to her grave. A secret that others are desperate to keep hidden." As they parted ways at the gates of Gossington Hall, Miss Marple felt a growing sense of anticipation. The mystery was beginning to take shape in her mind, like a jigsaw puzzle where key pieces were finally falling into place. The peacock brooch, with its brilliant colors and watchful eye-like patterns, seemed an apt symbol for the secrets that had lain dormant for so long in St. Mary Mead. She looked forward to a conversation with Catherine Lacey. The young woman clearly knew more than she was saying, and Miss Marple suspected that whatever information she possessed would be the key to understanding why a decorative brooch had become the center of so much desperate activity. Walking home through the sun-dappled lanes, Miss Marple reflected that human nature remained remarkably consistent across time. The passions and fears that drove people to deception, theft, and even violence changed very little from one generation to the next. Like the recurring patterns in her knitting, certain themes in human behavior emerged again and again, recognizable to those who knew what to look for. And Miss Jane Marple, despite her benign appearance and gentle manner, knew exactly what to look for. Chapter 4. The Photograph in the Attic. Miss Marple had spent the morning tending to her garden, finding the familiar tasks of weeding and pruning conducive to clear thinking. By the time she came indoors to prepare for Miss Lacey's visit, she had mentally arranged the facts of the case as methodically as she had arranged her border of Michaelmas daisies. At precisely 4 o'clock, there was a knock at her door. Catherine Lacey stood on the doorstep, looking pale but determined. She was dressed in a simple blue dress that emphasized her slender figure, her dark hair neatly arranged beneath a small hat. "Do come in, my dear," said Miss Marple warmly. "I've just made a fresh pot of tea, and my housekeeper has baked some of her excellent seed cake." She led the way into her sitting room, a cozy space filled with comfortable, if slightly worn furniture, embroidered cushions, and delicate china ornaments. It was a room that spoke of a life well lived, with each object holding its own story and significance. Once they were settled with tea and cake, Miss Marple observed her guest carefully. Up close, Catherine Lacey's resemblance to the portrait of Mrs. Lacey that had hung in Fairview House was striking. The same direct gaze and finely drawn features, though the young woman's face was marred by an expression of anxiety that her grandmother had never shown to the world. "Now, my dear," said Miss Marple gently, "you wish to speak to me about the peacock brooch." Catherine set down her teacup with a slight tremor. "Yes. I've been searching for it ever since grandmother died. I believed it was hidden somewhere in Fairview House, but then it turned up at your village fete, and now it's been stolen again." "Why is the brooch so important to you?" asked Miss Marple. Catherine hesitated. "I believe it holds the key to a family secret, a secret my grandmother kept for most of her life." "Perhaps you should start at the beginning," suggested Miss Marple. With a deep breath, Catherine began her story. After her grandmother's death, she had been tasked with clearing out Fairview House. In the attic, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, she discovered a small wooden box. It contained newspaper clippings about the theft of a valuable brooch from Gossington Hall in 1925, she explained. The descriptions matched exactly what I knew of my grandmother's peacock brooch, which I had seen only a few times as a child. She kept it locked away most of the time, saying it was too valuable to wear. "Most interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "What else was in the box?" "A photograph," said Catherine, reaching into her handbag. She withdrew a slightly faded photograph and handed it to Miss Marple. It was taken in 1935, a full decade after the brooch was supposedly stolen. Miss Marple examined the photograph carefully. It showed a small gathering of people in what appeared to be a private dining room. In the center of the group stood a younger Mrs. Lacey, elegant in an evening gown, with the peacock brooch prominently displayed on her bodice. The other people in the photograph were unfamiliar to Miss Marple, except for one, a much younger version of Mrs. Simmons, standing slightly apart from the group but unmistakably included in the gathering. "You see," said Catherine, "grandmother had the brooch years after it disappeared from Gossington Hall. She must have been involved in its theft somehow, or at least known who took it." "Not necessarily," cautioned Miss Marple. "There might be other explanations. Was there anything else in the box?" "Letters," replied Catherine. "Several letters that hinted at a connection between my grandmother and the Bantry family that went beyond mere acquaintance. They were vague, but they suggested some sort of romantic entanglement." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "With Colonel Bantry?" "No, I don't think so. The letters refer to someone called H. From what Colonel Bantry told you, I suspect it might have been his uncle, Henry Bantry. The black sheep he mentioned. I see, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. And did you find anything else? Catherine's expression became troubled. There were other letters, more recent ones, from a man named Edward Harrington. He claimed to be my grandmother's illegitimate half-brother, though I'd never heard of him before. He's been searching for the brooch for years, apparently. Half-brother? Miss Marple looked surprised. That would make him the son of your great-grandmother. Or so he claims. I'm not entirely convinced. His letters became increasingly demanding toward the end of grandmother's life. She never responded to them, as far as I can tell, but she kept them all. Miss Marple considered this new information carefully. If Mr. Harrington was indeed Mrs. Lacey's half-brother, that might explain his interest in the brooch. He could see it as part of his rightful inheritance. But there was something about the situation that didn't quite fit the pattern she was beginning to discern. My dear, she said, I think we should visit Fairview House and examine the attic more thoroughly. There might be additional clues you've overlooked. Catherine agreed readily. I still have the keys, and the house is empty. We can go now, if you like. They walked together to Fairview House, a substantial Victorian residence set back from the high street behind a small garden. Inside, the house had the forlorn air of a place whose soul had departed. Furniture draped in dust sheets, pictures removed from walls, leaving pale rectangles behind, the silence unbroken by the small sounds of habitation. Miss Marple followed Catherine up 2 flights of stairs to the attic, a large space with sloping ceilings and dormer windows that let in the afternoon sunlight. It was clear that someone had been through the space systematically. Trunks stood open, their contents disturbed, and boxes had been moved from their original positions. It wasn't like this when I found the box, said Catherine with dismay. Someone has searched the attic since then. When were you last here? Asked Miss Marple. 3 days ago, just before the fete. I came to look for the brooch one more time, but it wasn't here. I never imagined it would turn up at the White Elephant stall. Miss Marple examined the disturbance thoughtfully. Whoever searched here knew what they were looking for. Do you still have the box with the letters and photograph? Yes, I took it with me. It's at my lodgings. That's fortunate. Now, where exactly did you find it? Catherine led her to a corner of the attic where a small area of floorboards was visibly different from the rest, being somewhat newer. Under here, there's a hollow space. Miss Marple knelt with some difficulty, her elderly joints protesting at the movement. Catherine quickly moved to help her, lifting the loose floorboard to reveal a shallow space beneath. It was empty except for a small leather-bound book pushed to the far back of the hiding place. A diary, exclaimed Catherine, reaching for it. I didn't see this before. The diary was worn with age, its pages yellowed and the ink faded in places. Catherine opened it carefully, revealing neat, feminine handwriting. It's my grandmother's diary from 1925. Miss Marple peered over her shoulder as Catherine turned the pages. Most entries were mundane records of social engagements and household matters, but occasionally there were more cryptic notes. Several mentioned P, with no further explanation. June 21st, 1925, read Catherine aloud. The house party at Gossington. H was attentive as always, despite his wife's presence. P causes me more anxiety than pleasure sometimes, but it is the only security I have left now. The date of the house party, when the brooch disappeared, bloated Miss Marple. Catherine turned more pages. July 3rd, 1925. Mrs. S knows more than she should. P is the secret that binds us now, for better or worse. Mrs. S, mused Miss Marple. Mrs. Simmons presumably, though she would have been Miss Parker then. They continued through the diary, finding occasional references to P and increasingly frequent mentions of Mrs. S, suggesting a complicated relationship that was neither entirely friendly nor hostile, but bound by some mutual understanding. As they were about to leave the attic, Miss Marple paused. Wait a moment, there's something else. Her sharp eyes had caught a glint of metal beneath a pile of discarded curtains. Pushing them aside, she revealed a small brass key. How curious, she said. picking it up. It looks too small to be a door key. Perhaps it opens a jewelry box, suggested Catherine, or a safe. Possibly, agreed Miss Marple. We should keep it, in any case. They had just closed the attic door behind them when they heard a sound from below, the unmistakable creaking of a floorboard. Someone else was in the house. Miss Marple put a finger to her lips, signaling Catherine to remain silent. They stood frozen on the landing, listening intently. Another creak, closer this time, followed by the soft sound of a door opening and closing. We should leave, whispered Catherine. Whoever it is might be the person who searched the attic. They made their way down the stairs as quietly as possible, Miss Marple leaning heavily on Catherine's arm. As they reached the ground floor, a shadow moved across the hallway ahead of them. Catherine stifled a gasp, and they pressed themselves against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. The shadow passed, and they heard the click of the back door opening. A moment later, it closed again, and silence fell over the house once more. They've gone, said Miss Marple softly. Through the garden, I imagine. They hurried to the front door and out onto the street, neither speaking until they were well away from Fairview House. Who do you think it was? Asked Catherine, her face pale with fright. I couldn't say for certain, replied Miss Marple, but I suspect it might have been Mr. Harrington. He seemed